When my son Marcus handed me that 30-day notice to vacate the home I'd lived in for 3 decades, I smiled and thanked him. He had no idea that while he was busy planning my eviction, I had already discovered his dirty little secret. The same secret that would put him and his entitled wife on the street within a week. Some lessons in respect come with interest, and Marcus was about to learn that the hard way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 58 years old, I thought I had seen every possible way a child could break their parents' heart. I was wrong. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered not by a process server or through the mail, but by my own son's manicured hands as he stood in my kitchen drinking the coffee I had just brewed for him. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, professionally printed on law firm letterhead. Rodriguez versus Rodriguez, it read at the top, my own last name weaponized against me. Marcus stood there in his tailored suit, adjusting his silver cufflinks while I read the document that would force me from the only home I had known since before he was born. Marcus had always been particular about his appearance, even as a child. Now at 35 he had perfected the look of success. His dark hair was styled with precision, his shoes shined to mirror brightness, his cologne subtle but expensive. Everything about him screamed money, status, achievement, everything except his character, apparently. "It's nothing personal, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone he had developed sometime in his 20s. "But Vivian and I need the space, and frankly this arrangement isn't working anymore. You understand, right?" I looked up from the legal document to study my son's face. There was no guilt there, no regret, just the cold calculation of a man who had made a business decision. Vivian, his wife of 5 years, stood behind him in the doorway, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair catching the morning sunlight. She wore a satisfied smile that she wasn't even trying to hide. 30 days, I said quietly, reading the notice again. "After 30 years you're giving me 30 days. That's more than legally required." Vivian chimed in, her voice honey-sweet with false sympathy. "We're being quite generous, actually. Most landlords only give tenants 2 weeks to vacate." Landlords. Tenants. These were the words my daughter-in-law used to describe our family relationship. I had become a tenant in the home where I had raised my son, where I had nursed him through childhood illnesses, helped him with homework, celebrated his achievements, and consoled him through his failures. "I see," I said, folding the notice carefully and setting it on the kitchen counter next to the plate of homemade empanadas I had prepared for Marcus's visit. He had always loved my empanadas, used to beg me to make them when he was stressed during law school. Now he didn't even glance at them. "We've already contacted a real estate agent," Marcus continued, his tone businesslike. "The house should sell quickly in this market. Vivian has her eye on a place in Meadowbrook Hills, and with the equity from this property, we can finally afford it." Meadowbrook Hills. The exclusive gated community where Vivian's parents lived, where the houses started at $2 million and the homeowners association had rules about everything from mailbox colors to the acceptable breeds of dogs. It was a world away from our modest neighborhood of hardworking families and small front yards where children played. "What about my things?" I asked, though I kept my voice level, almost conversational. 30 years of belongings don't just disappear overnight. "There's a storage facility on Pine Street," Vivian said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what looked like a notes app. "I've already researched the rates. A 10 by 10 unit should be sufficient for whatever you can't fit in your new place. Assuming you find one quickly enough." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. They had planned this down to the storage unit dimensions. While I had been making them Sunday dinners and babysitting their friends' children when they wanted romantic getaways, they had been calculating square footage for my displaced possessions. "I suppose you've thought of everything," I said, standing up from the kitchen table where I had signed homework assignments and packed countless school lunches and listened to teenage confessions about first heartbreaks. "We've tried to be thorough," Marcus replied, missing entirely the edge in my voice. "Oh, and Mom, we'll need you to sign these papers acknowledging that you're leaving voluntarily. It makes the whole process smoother from a legal standpoint." He slid another document across the table, this one simpler than the eviction notice but no less devastating. By signing it, I would be agreeing that I had no legal claim to the house, no right to contest the eviction, no recourse if they changed their minds about the timeline. I picked up the pen Marcus offered, a heavy silver thing that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. But instead of signing, I set it down and looked directly into my son's eyes. You know, Marcus, you're absolutely right about one thing. This arrangement isn't working anymore. Something in my tone must have penetrated his self-satisfied confidence because his expression shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering across his features. But Vivian was still smiling, still basking in her victory. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, she said. I know change can be hard for people your age, but sometimes it's necessary for everyone to move forward. People your age, as if 58 was ancient, as if I was some doddering old woman who needed to be managed and relocated like an inconvenient piece of furniture. I had been younger than Vivian was now when I bought this house, when I took on a 30-year mortgage as a single mother working 2 jobs to provide stability for my son. Where will you go? Marcus asked, and for a moment I heard an echo of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by his current version of concern, which was really just a desire to avoid complications. I'll figure something out, I said, standing up and smoothing my apron. Don't worry about me. We're not worried, Vivian said quickly, too quickly. We know you're very resourceful. Resourceful, another carefully chosen word, designed to make my impending homelessness sound like a character trait, rather than a crisis they were creating. I had been resourceful when I stretched every dollar to pay the mortgage while Marcus was growing up. Resourceful when I worked overtime to afford his college tuition. Resourceful when I took out a second mortgage to help fund his law school education. Well then, I said, walking them toward the front door, I suppose there's nothing left to discuss. Marcus paused at the threshold, and for a moment I thought he might say something meaningful, something that acknowledged the magnitude of what he was doing. Instead, he straightened his tie and said, the real estate agent will need access to show the house, so if you could keep everything neat and tidy, that would be helpful. Of course, I replied. I wouldn't want to inconvenience anyone. After they left, I stood in my empty kitchen, listening to the silence that seemed to echo differently now that I knew it had an expiration date. The house felt the same as always, warm and welcoming, filled with the accumulated comfort of 3 decades of living. But now it also felt temporary, fragile, like something that could be taken away with a signature on legal paperwork. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat back down at the kitchen table, spreading the eviction notice in front of me, like a map to a destination I didn't want to visit. Marcus Rodriguez versus Elena Rodriguez. My own son had taken me to court, hired lawyers, initiated legal proceedings to throw me out of my home. The home that wasn't technically mine anymore, though I had never fully understood when or how that had changed. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny reminders of impermanence. I had cleaned these windows thousands of times, watched the seasons change through this glass, observed Marcus growing up in the backyard beyond. Now I was seeing it all with the eyes of someone who would soon be locked out forever. But as I sat there, sipping my coffee and staring at the legal documents that would uproot my entire life, something strange happened. Instead of the crushing despair I expected to feel, I felt something else entirely: clarity. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was seeing my situation with perfect crystalline clarity. Marcus and Vivian had made a mistake, not just a moral mistake, though their cruelty was breathtaking in its casual completeness. They had made a tactical mistake, a legal mistake, a mistake that would cost them everything they thought they were gaining. They had assumed I was powerless, that I would simply accept their decision and shuffle quietly into whatever diminished future they had planned for me. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Richard Chen had been my lawyer for 15 years, handling everything from my divorce to property disputes, to the complex legal work surrounding my small business investments. He was also one of the few people who knew the whole truth about my financial situation. Elena, Richard's voice was warm with genuine affection when he answered. How are you doing? I've been better, I said, glancing at the eviction notice. Richard, I need to see you today. Can you fit me in? Of course, what's going on? My son is trying to evict me from my house. There was a long pause. Richard had met Marcus several times over the years, had even helped with some of his legal paperwork when he was starting his career. He knew how much I had sacrificed for my son's success. "I'll make time," he said simply. "Can you be here in an hour?" Richard's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, all dark wood and Persian rugs, and the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and established reputation. I had always felt comfortable there, in part because Richard had never treated me like anything other than an equal, despite the vast differences in our education and social standing. "Show me what they gave you," he said, after we had exchanged pleasantries and I had settled into the leather chair across from his desk. I handed him the eviction notice and the voluntary departure agreement. Richard put on his reading glasses and studied both documents carefully, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. "Elena," he said finally, setting the papers down and looking at me directly, "do you understand what Marcus is trying to do here? Throw me out of my house, so he and his wife can sell it and buy a bigger one." "It's more than that." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "He's trying to establish that you're a tenant in a property he owns. If you sign this voluntary departure agreement, you're legally acknowledging that he has the right to evict you, that you have no ownership claim to the house." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "But I do have an ownership claim, don't I?" Richard was quiet for a moment, studying my face. "Elena, whose name is on the deed to the house, well, Marcus is on there now. I added him years ago for estate planning purposes. Remember, you handled the paperwork, but I'm still on there too, right?" Richard reached for his computer, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Let me pull up the current property records." While he searched, I tried to remember the details of that estate planning meeting. It had been maybe 8 years ago, after I had a minor health scare and realized I needed to get my affairs in order. Richard had recommended adding Marcus to the deed so that the property would transfer to him automatically if something happened to me, avoiding probate and potential complications. "Here it is," Richard said, turning his computer screen so I could see it. "Elena, according to the current deed, Marcus is listed as the sole owner of the property. Your name was removed 3 years ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible. I never signed anything removing my name." "You did actually." Richard pulled up another document. "Here's your signature on a quitclaim deed, transferring your ownership interest to Marcus. It was notarized and filed with the county. Perfectly legal." I stared at the screen, at what was unmistakably my own signature on a document I didn't remember signing. "Richard, I swear to you, I don't remember doing this. When was the last time you signed legal papers for Marcus? Think carefully." I cast my mind back, trying to piece together the fragments of memory. There were some papers for refinancing, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Marcus said the interest rates were much better, that he could save us money on the monthly payments. He brought them by the house one evening, said he needed my signature as a co-owner. Richard's expression was grim. "Elena, I think your son tricked you into signing away your house." The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. "Can he do that? Is it legal? If you signed it willingly, even if you didn't understand what you were signing, it's legal. The question is whether you were deceived about the nature of the documents." "I was definitely deceived," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "He told me it was refinancing paperwork, not a deed transfer. That could be grounds for challenging the transaction, but it would be difficult to prove. It would be his word against yours about what he told you when you signed." I sat in silence for a moment, letting the full scope of my son's betrayal sink in. He hadn't just decided to evict me. He had been planning this for years, carefully maneuvering me into a position where I had no legal protection, no recourse, no power to resist. "What are my options?" I asked finally. "Legally, not many. You could challenge the deed transfer, but as I said, it would be difficult without evidence of fraud. You could refuse to leave and force them to complete the eviction process, but that would just delay the inevitable and cost you money and legal fees. What about morally? What about the fact that I've been paying the mortgage on this house for 30 years? Richard's smile was sad. "Morality doesn't count for much in property law, Elena. The person whose name is on the deed owns the house. Everything else is just family drama, as far as the courts are concerned." I felt tears threatening for the first time since Marcus had handed me the eviction notice, but I blinked them back. So he gets the house, the equity, everything. Not necessarily. Richard leaned forward, his expression shifting to something more calculating. Tell me, Elena, what else do you own besides the house? What do you mean? I mean, what are your other assets? Your investments, your business interests, your savings, everything you've built over the years. I looked at Richard carefully, wondering how much to reveal. We had worked together for 15 years, but the full extent of my financial situation was something I had kept private from everyone, including Marcus. Especially Marcus. Why do you ask? Because if your son thinks he's dealing with a powerless elderly woman, who will quietly accept being homeless, he's made a serious miscalculation. But if you have resources he doesn't know about, options he hasn't considered, then this becomes a very different kind of fight. I studied Richard's face, seeing the same sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most respected property lawyers in the city. He was telling me without saying it directly, that there might be ways to fight back, that didn't involve challenging the deed transfer. What kind of different fight? The kind where you have more power than he realizes. The kind where you can make choices that he can't predict or control. Slowly, carefully, I began to tell Richard about the financial life I had built in secret over the past 30 years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The investments I had made with money I saved by living modestly, the small rental properties I had purchased and managed discreetly, the business partnerships that had grown from a few $1,000s into something much more substantial. By the time I finished, Richard was staring at me with undisguised admiration. Elena, do you realize what you've done? While your son was building his career on money you provided, you were building your own empire. You're not a victim here. You're a businesswoman who's been playing a very long game. I never thought of it that way. Well, start thinking of it that way. Because Marcus has just declared war on someone who has resources he can't even imagine. Someone who's been underestimated her entire life and used that underestimation to her advantage. As I left Richard's office that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because my situation had improved, but because I finally understood the true nature of the game I was playing. Marcus thought he was checkmating a pawn. He had no idea he was attacking a queen. That evening, sitting alone in my kitchen with the eviction notice still spread across the table, I found myself remembering the day Marcus was born. It was a cold February morning 35 years ago, and I was terrified, not just of childbirth, though that was scary enough for a 23-year-old woman whose husband had walked out 6 months earlier. I was terrified of everything that came after. How would I provide for this child? How would I give him the life he deserved when I could barely afford groceries? The snow was falling heavily outside the hospital window when I first held my son. He was so small, so perfect, with tiny fingers that gripped mine with surprising strength. In that moment, holding him against my chest, I made a promise that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. I promised him that he would never want for anything, that no matter what it cost me, he would have every opportunity, every advantage, every chance to succeed that I had never had. I kept that promise, even when it nearly killed me. Marcus's father, David, had been charming and handsome and completely unprepared for the reality of supporting a family. When I told him I was pregnant, he looked at me like I had just announced I had a terminal illness. Elena, we can't afford a baby right now, he said, as if the timing was something we could negotiate. Maybe in a few years, when I get the promotion at the dealership. But life doesn't wait for convenient timing. When I refused to consider his suggestion that we take care of the problem, David became increasingly distant. He started working late, going out with friends on weekends, finding excuses to avoid talking about the future. By the time I was 6 months pregnant, he had moved in with a coworker who had no children and no plans for any. The divorce was finalized when Marcus was 3 months old. David signed away his parental rights as easily as he had signed his name on our marriage certificate, and with about as much thought. The judge ordered him to pay child support, but David had already proven that legal obligations meant nothing to him. I received exactly 2 payments before he disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a forwarding address in another state and a phone number that was disconnected within a month. So it was just Marcus and me in a tiny one-bedroom apartment that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs and had radiators that clanged all night like angry ghosts. I worked at a medical clinic during the day, filing insurance claims and scheduling appointments, while Marcus stayed with Mrs. Petrov, an elderly Russian woman who watched children in her apartment for $5 a day. It wasn't ideal, but it was what I could afford. At night, after putting Marcus to bed in the portable crib that took up half our bedroom, I would sit at the kitchen table that doubled as my desk and work on my high school equivalency degree. I had dropped out at 17 to get married, convinced that love would be enough to build a life on. Now, with a baby depending on me, I realized that love without education was just sentiment. It wouldn't pay rent or buy formula or provide the stability my son deserved. The GED took me 2 years to complete, studying between diaper changes and feedings, taking practice tests while Marcus napped. When I finally passed the exam, I cried in the parking lot of the testing center, not from relief but from exhaustion. The degree was just the beginning of what I knew would be a very long climb. Marcus was 3 when I started taking night classes at the community college, working toward an associate degree in business administration. Mrs. Petrov agreed to watch him in the evenings. Bless her heart, though I knew the extra hours were hard on her aging joints. I would rush home from work, grab a quick dinner with Marcus, help him with his toddler activities, put him to bed, and then drive across town to sit in classrooms filled with people who were mostly younger than me, most of whom didn't have children waiting at home. The other students would complain about being tired, about having to work part-time jobs to pay for school. I wanted to laugh, or maybe scream. Try being tired when you've been up since 5 in the morning, worked 8 hours, spent the evening caring for a small child, and now you're sitting in an accounting class at 9 o'clock at night because it's the only time they offer it. Try managing a part-time job when you're already working full-time and every extra hour you spend away from your child feels like a small betrayal. But I kept going. Marcus needed me to keep going. When he started kindergarten, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. Not because parenting was easier, but because his schedule aligned better with mine. I could pick him up from school, help him with homework, make him dinner, and still get to my evening classes. He would often come with me to the college, sitting quietly in the back of lecture halls with coloring books and picture books, while I took notes on marketing strategies and financial planning. The other students thought it was sweet, the way Marcus would wave at me from his little corner, the way he would whisper "Good job, Mama," after particularly difficult exams. What they didn't understand was that he wasn't just my son in those moments. He was my motivation, my reminder of why I was sacrificing sleep and social connections and any semblance of a normal young adult life. I graduated with my associate degree when Marcus was 7 and immediately started working toward my bachelor's degree. By then, I had found a better job at a small accounting firm, where my boss Patricia Williams recognized my potential and was willing to work around my school schedule. Patricia became more than a boss, she became a mentor, teaching me not just about business, but about building wealth, about making smart investments, about planning for the future in ways that went beyond just surviving paycheck to paycheck. "Elena," Patricia said one day, reviewing my work on a client's tax return, "you have a natural head for numbers. Have you ever thought about starting your own business?" The idea seemed impossible. I was barely managing to pay rent and tuition, buy groceries and school supplies for Marcus, keep our ancient car running long enough to get us where we needed to go. Starting a business required capital, connections, confidence. I had none of those things. But Patricia saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. Over the months that followed, she began giving me small freelance projects, helping me build a client base while I finished school. Tax preparation for her friends, bookkeeping for small businesses, financial planning for people who needed professional help but couldn't afford the big firms downtown. Slowly, carefully, I began to understand that I had skills that people valued, knowledge that they were willing to pay for. Marcus was 10 when I finally bought our house. It wasn't much to look at, a modest 2-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood that was more blue-collar than suburban, but it had a fenced yard, where Marcus could play, and a quiet street, where he could ride his bike. Most importantly, it was ours. After years of renting, of having landlords who could raise the rent or decide to sell the property with no warning, we finally had stability. The mortgage felt enormous at first. $1,200 a month seemed impossible when I was used to paying $800 in rent. But Patricia had helped me understand the mathematics of home ownership, how the payments would build equity instead of disappearing into someone else's pocket, how the tax benefits would offset some of the cost, how property values in our neighborhood were likely to appreciate over time. Think of it as paying yourself rent, she told me as we reviewed the loan documents. Every payment is an investment in your family's future. Marcus loved the house from the first day. He claimed the smaller bedroom as his own, hanging posters of athletes and movie characters on walls that we could paint any color we wanted. He helped me plant flowers in the front yard, his small hands carefully patting dirt around the roots of marigolds and petunias. He learned to mow the lawn, to rake leaves, to shovel snow from the driveway. For the first time in his young life, he felt like he belonged somewhere permanent. Those were good years, maybe the best years. Marcus was succeeding in school, making friends, playing soccer in the city league. I had finally graduated with my bachelor's degree and was building a thriving freelance accounting practice while still working part-time for Patricia. Money was still tight, but it was manageable. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, stable, secure. I should have known it wouldn't last. Marcus started changing when he entered high school. It was subtle at first, small shifts in attitude and behavior that I told myself were normal teenage development. He became more conscious of what other kids had, more aware of the differences between our modest lifestyle and the affluence he saw around him. Our neighborhood was solidly middle class, but the high school drew from several different areas, including some of the wealthier suburbs on the other side of town. "Mom, why don't we have a bigger house?" he asked one evening at dinner, picking at the spaghetti and meatballs that had been his favorite meal since childhood. "What's wrong with our house?" I replied, though I could guess where this was coming from. "Nothing's wrong with it, it's just small. Tommy Brennan's house has 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. They have a pool and a 3-car garage. Tommy Brennan's father is a surgeon, Marcus. Different families have different circumstances, but you're an accountant. Don't accountants make good money?" I set down my fork, choosing my words carefully. "I make enough money to provide for us comfortably. We have everything we need, and most of what we want. That's more than many families can say." Marcus nodded, but I could see he wasn't satisfied with my answer. Over the following months, his questions became more pointed, his observations more critical. Why did I drive an older car when some of his friends' mothers drove new SUVs? Why couldn't we go on expensive vacations like other families? Why did I shop at discount stores instead of the mall? I tried to explain the values I had hoped to instill in him. That happiness didn't come from material possessions. That hard work and education were more important than status symbols. That being grateful for what you have was the key to contentment. But my words seemed to bounce off him like raindrops on glass. The real trouble started during his junior year, when Marcus became friends with a group of boys whose families lived in Meadowbrook Hills, the same exclusive community where Vivian's parents would later reside. These boys had never known financial struggle, never questioned whether they could afford something they wanted, never understood that money was finite and choices had consequences. Marcus began asking for things that were simply beyond our budget: designer clothes, expensive electronics, a car that cost more than I made in 6 months. When I explained that we couldn't afford these things, he would point out that his friends' parents managed to provide them without apparent difficulty. "Maybe you should try harder," he said one day, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "Maybe if you worked more, or found better clients, or stopped being so scared of taking risks." Scared of taking risks. This from the boy whose entire stable, comfortable life had been built on my willingness to take risks. The risk of going back to school as a single mother. The risk of starting my own business with no capital and no connections. The risk of buying a house when I could barely afford the down payment. Every security he enjoyed, every opportunity he took for granted, existed because I had been brave enough to risk failure in pursuit of something better. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I took on more clients, worked longer hours, found ways to squeeze additional income from an already packed schedule. I told myself that this was temporary, that Marcus was just going through a phase, that once he matured he would understand and appreciate the sacrifices I had made for him. I was wrong about that too. College applications brought a whole new level of financial pressure. Marcus had his heart set on prestigious schools, universities, where the tuition alone cost more than most people's annual salary. When I suggested he consider state schools, more affordable options that would still provide an excellent education, he looked at me with genuine disgust. "Mom, you can't be serious. Do you want me to end up like you? End up like me?" A woman who had built a successful business from nothing, who owned her own home, who had provided her child with stability and opportunity, despite starting with no advantages whatsoever. In Marcus's mind, this was apparently a fate to be avoided at all costs. The guidance counselor at his high school suggested we meet to discuss financial aid options. Mrs. Henderson was a kind woman who had helped hundreds of families navigate the college application process, and she understood the delicate balance between dreams and reality. "Marcus has excellent grades and test scores," she said, reviewing his file. "He could qualify for merit scholarships at several very good schools, not the Ivy League schools he's focused on, but excellent universities where he could get a top-notch education without putting you into debt." "What about the Ivy League schools?" Marcus interrupted. "What would it take to make those work financially?" Mrs. Henderson pulled out a calculator and began running numbers. "Well, let's see. Harvard's annual cost is about $70,000. Over 4 years, you're looking at close to $300,000, assuming no increases. Your family income is too high for need-based aid, so you'd be paying full price, unless Marcus receives merit scholarships, which are extremely competitive at that level. $300,000. I had worked for 15 years to build up enough savings and business equity to feel financially secure. The cost of 4 years at Marcus's dream school would wipe out everything I had accumulated, and then some. We'll make it work." I heard myself saying, though I had no idea how. "Education is the most important investment we can make." Mrs. Henderson looked at me with sympathy and concern. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I've seen many families take on substantial debt for college, and I want to make sure you understand the long-term implications. Borrowing $300,000 would mean payments of several $1,000s a month for decades. It could impact your ability to retire, to handle medical emergencies, to maintain your current standard of living." But Marcus had already stopped listening. In his mind, the decision was made. He would go to the best school that accepted him, and I would find a way to pay for it. The details were my problem to solve. He was accepted to 3 Ivy League schools, and chose the most expensive one, Columbia University in New York City. The acceptance letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March, and Marcus's joy was so pure, so complete, that I couldn't bring myself to dampen it with practical concerns. He had worked hard, earned this opportunity through his own merit and dedication. How could I deny him the future he had dreamed of? I refinanced the house, taking out every dollar of equity I had built up over 15 years of mortgage payments. I liquidated my retirement accounts, paying penalties and taxes that reduced the value by nearly 30%. I borrowed against my business assets, putting the client relationships I had spent years building at risk if I couldn't keep up with the payments. By the time Marcus left for college that fall, I had committed every financial resource I possessed to funding his education. The woman who had always been careful with money, who had built wealth slowly and steadily through disciplined saving and smart investments, had bet everything on her son's future. Marcus called home regularly during his freshman year, full of excitement about his classes, his professors, his new friends. He told me about internship opportunities at prestigious financial firms, about networking events with successful alumni, about the connections he was making that would serve him well throughout his career. He sounded happy, confident, optimistic about the future. The investment was paying off exactly as I had hoped. The problems started during his sophomore year, though I didn't recognize them as problems at first. Marcus's calls became less frequent, and when he did call, he often sounded distracted, rushed, like he was checking an obligation off his list. He still expressed appreciation for my financial support, but it had become perfunctory, automatic, like thanking someone for holding a door open. "How are your grades?" I would ask. "Fine, Mom. Good. Look, I have to run to a study group. Are you eating well? Are you getting enough sleep?" Yes, I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'll call you next week." But the calls next week often didn't come.
I found myself checking my phone obsessively,
wondering if something was wrong, worrying that Marcus was struggling and didn't want to worry me. When I tried calling him directly, I would get voicemail more often than not, and his return calls came hours or days later with explanations about being in the library or having his phone on silent during lectures. The truth, I later learned, was that Marcus was embarrassed by me. Not by my love or my support or my sacrifices, but by my modest background, my working-class roots, my lack of sophistication. His new friends came from families with generational wealth, parents who were corporate executives and government officials and society figures. When they talked about their families, they spoke of country club memberships and European vacations and summer homes in the Hamptons. Marcus had nothing equivalent to contribute to these conversations. His mother was a small-town accountant who drove a 10-year-old car and shopped at Target. His childhood home was comfortable but unremarkable, located in a neighborhood that wouldn't impress anyone who mattered to him now. His family story was one of struggle and sacrifice, which felt to him like an admission of failure rather than a testament to resilience. So he began to edit me out of his narrative. When classmates asked about his family, he would give vague answers about his business background without specifying that my business was a freelance accounting practice run from a converted bedroom. When they asked about his hometown, he would mention the name of our city but not the specific neighborhood where we lived. When they asked how his family could afford Columbia's tuition, he would imply that money had never been a concern rather than explaining the sacrifices that made it possible. I didn't understand any of this during his college years. I attributed his growing distance to the natural process of a young man becoming independent, building his own identity separate from his family. I told myself that this was healthy, that I should be proud of raising a son who could thrive in an environment so different from the one where he grew up. But the distance grew wider each year. By the time Marcus graduated, our conversations had become stilted, formal, like interactions between acquaintances rather than family members. He would dutifully call on my birthday and major holidays, ask polite questions about my work and my health, and deflect my questions about his life with generalities and platitudes. The law school years were even worse. Marcus chose Harvard Law School, which required another massive financial commitment just as I was beginning to recover from the costs of his undergraduate education. This time, the refinancing options were more limited, the asset liquidation more painful, the debt burden more crushing. But I told myself it was worth it. Marcus was building toward a career that would eventually provide financial security, not just for himself, but potentially for both of us. "Just think, Mom," he said during one of our rare phone conversations during his first year of law school. "In a few years, I'll be making enough money to take care of both of us. You won't have to work so hard anymore." It was the first time in years that he had acknowledged my financial struggles, and hearing him express concern for my welfare filled me with hope. Maybe the distance between us was temporary, a necessary part of his growth that would eventually bring us closer together. Maybe all the sacrifice and hardship would ultimately strengthen our relationship rather than erode it. I should have paid more attention to the word "take care of." It implied a relationship between caretaker and dependent, benefactor and recipient, rather than the mutual respect and partnership I had imagined. Marcus met Vivian during his third year of law school. She was a year behind him, the daughter of a prominent federal judge and a society philanthropist. Her family had the kind of old money respectability that Marcus had always envied, the automatic social standing that came with generations of wealth and influence. She was beautiful, intelligent, ambitious, and utterly convinced of her own superiority. When Marcus brought her home for the first time, I could see immediately that she found our house quaint at best, primitive at worst. She complimented the garden with the kind of condescending appreciation one might show for a child's art project. She admired the cozy living room with its second-hand furniture and family photographs. She asked if I had lived in the house for a long time, as if longevity of residence was a marker of limited ambition rather than stability. "Marcus tells me you're in business for yourself," Vivian said over dinner, cutting her pot roast into tiny, precise pieces. "That must be challenging in a small town like this." "It has its advantages," I replied, though I could hear the defensive tone creeping into my voice. "I know my clients personally, and there's less competition than in the bigger cities." "Oh, I'm sure. There's something to be said for being a big fish in a small pond." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, big fish in a small pond. The clear implication was that my success was relative, impressive only within the limited context of my modest circumstances. In the larger world where she and Marcus moved, I would be nothing special, just another small-town service provider without sophistication or significance. Marcus said nothing during this exchange. He didn't defend me or challenge Vivian's condescension. He simply continued eating, as if the conversation was happening to someone else, as if he wasn't responsible for protecting his mother from his girlfriend's subtle cruelty. That was when I should have recognized what was happening. The son I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, was choosing his new life over his old one, and I was part of what he was leaving behind. After they left that weekend, I found a real estate brochure on my coffee table. It featured luxury condominiums in Boston, the kind of high-end properties that cost more than most people would make in a lifetime. Someone had highlighted the penthouse listings and marked them with handwritten notes about square footage and amenities. The message was clear: this was the kind of place where successful people lived, not modest ranch houses in working-class neighborhoods. I should have thrown the brochure away, but instead I kept it, studying it like a map to a foreign country I would never visit. This was the world Marcus wanted to inhabit, the life he was building with Vivian. And I was increasingly aware that there was no place for me in it. The wedding planning process confirmed all my fears. Every decision was made by Vivian and her mother, with Marcus serving as an occasionally consulted advisor. I was informed of choices after they had been finalized, presented with costs after they had been incurred, included in events only when etiquette absolutely demanded my presence. The wedding itself cost more than I had spent on Marcus's entire undergraduate education. The venue was a historic mansion with gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. The flowers were flown in from Holland. The photographer had shot celebrity weddings featured in major magazines. Everything was perfect, elegant, expensive beyond reason. I paid for it all, of course. Not because anyone asked me to, but because Marcus made it clear that his new in-laws expected traditional arrangements, and he couldn't afford his share of the expenses on a new lawyer's salary. The request came indirectly, through a series of conversations about family contributions and shared responsibilities that somehow always ended with me writing another check. By the time the wedding was over, I had mortgaged my business assets, borrowed against my life insurance, and committed to debt payments that would stretch for decades. But Marcus and Vivian had the wedding of their dreams, and they began their marriage in the style to which Vivian's family was accustomed. The newlyweds moved into a house in Vivian's parents' neighborhood, a place where the property taxes alone were more than most people's rent. Marcus joined a prestigious law firm, where his father-in-law's connections had secured him a position. Vivian continued law school, while decorating their new home with furniture that cost more than cars. I still didn't understand the long-term plan. I thought I was helping them get established, providing a financial foundation that would eventually allow them to prosper independently. I thought that once Marcus's career was fully launched, once they were settled and secure, we would return to the close relationship we had enjoyed when he was younger. Instead, the distance between us became an ocean. Phone calls became less frequent, then rare, then essentially non-existent, except for holidays and birthdays. Visits stopped entirely. When I suggested coming to see their new house, there was always a reason why the timing wasn't good. Work was busy, they were traveling. The house was being painted. Something always prevented me from seeing the life my money had helped create. But I was still needed when financial emergencies arose. When Marcus's law firm was slow to pay bonuses and they couldn't make their mortgage payment. When Vivian wanted to join an exclusive country club and needed money for the initiation fees. When they decided to remodel their kitchen and discovered that luxury renovations cost more than they had budgeted. Each time, the request came wrapped in language about family obligations and temporary difficulties. Each time, I was assured that this would be the last time, that their financial situation was improving, that they would soon be in a position to help me rather than the other way around. Each time, I said yes, because he was my son, and I couldn't bear the thought of him struggling when I had the power to help. Because I loved him more than I valued my own security. Because I still believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that someday he would understand what I had given up for him and appreciate the depth of my sacrifice. I was 60 years old when I finally admitted to myself that Marcus was never going to change, that the boy who had once told me I was his hero had grown into a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of funding. That the son I had raised to value education and hard work and integrity had learned instead to value money and status and social connections above everything else. But by then it was too late to change the fundamental dynamics of our relationship. I had trained him to see me as someone whose primary function was to solve his financial problems. I had taught him that my love was unconditional, that my support would always be available regardless of how he treated me, that my needs and feelings were secondary to his comfort and convenience. I had created the very situation that was now destroying me, and I had no one to blame but myself. Or so I thought, until that March morning when Marcus handed me the eviction notice, and I realized that he hadn't just learned to take my generosity for granted. He had learned to see me as an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a liability to be eliminated from his carefully constructed new life. That was when I stopped blaming myself and started planning my response. The revelation about my true financial position changed everything. Not just my strategy for dealing with Marcus and Vivian, but my entire understanding of who I was and what I had become over the past 3 decades. While I had been playing the role of the struggling single mother who sacrificed everything for her son's success, I had simultaneously been building an empire that neither of them suspected existed. It started with Patricia Williams, my mentor at the accounting firm, where I worked in my 20s. Patricia was the first person to suggest that I had a natural talent for recognizing undervalued opportunities, for seeing potential where others saw only problems. She was also the first person to explain to me that wealth wasn't just about earning money, it was about making money work for you. Elena, she said one afternoon, as we reviewed a client's investment portfolio, you're spending all your energy working for dollars. Smart people make their dollars work for them. This was a foreign concept to someone who had grown up believing that hard work was the only path to financial security. My parents had been factory workers who lived paycheck to paycheck, saving every penny for emergencies that seemed to arrive with depressing regularity. The idea that money could generate more money without corresponding labor seemed almost magical. But Patricia was patient in her teaching, generous with her knowledge. She explained compound interest and dividend reinvestment, and the tax advantages of retirement accounts. She showed me how to read financial statements and evaluate market trends. Most importantly, she helped me understand that successful investing required a long-term perspective, the willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for future security. Start small, she advised. Take whatever you can save each month, even if it's only $50, and invest it consistently. Don't try to time the market or chase hot stocks, just buy solid companies and hold them for years. My first investment was 100 shares of Johnson & Johnson, purchased when Marcus was 8 years old, and I was working 3 part-time jobs to pay the mortgage and put food on the table. $150 that I could barely spare, money that could have gone toward Marcus's school clothes or our grocery budget, or the countless other expenses that seemed to consume every dollar I earned. But I had been reading everything I could find about investing, studying the annual reports that companies sent to shareholders, learning to analyze balance sheets and income statements the same way I analyzed my clients' tax returns. Johnson & Johnson was a company I understood, with products I used, a business model that seemed sustainable regardless of economic conditions. People would always need healthcare products, regardless of recessions or market downturns or political changes. That first investment grew slowly but steadily. Within 5 years, my $150 had become $300. Not a fortune, certainly, but proof that Patricia's advice was sound. More importantly, it was proof that I could build wealth through patience and discipline rather than relying solely on the income from my labor. As my accounting practice grew, and my income became more stable, I began investing larger amounts more regularly. $500 a month, then $1,000, then more, as my client base expanded and my fees increased. I diversified beyond individual stocks into mutual funds and real estate investment trusts and municipal bonds that provided tax-free income. But the real breakthrough came when I started investing in rental properties. The first property was a small duplex in a neighborhood that was transitioning from industrial to residential, 3 miles from our house. The building was ugly, with brown brick walls and tiny windows, and a layout that seemed designed by someone who had never actually lived in an apartment. But the numbers were attractive. The purchase price was low enough that the rental income would cover the mortgage payments and taxes and still provide a small monthly profit. More importantly, the neighborhood was changing. The old warehouses were being converted into artist studios and trendy restaurants. Young professionals were moving in, attracted by the affordable rents and the proximity to downtown. Property values were rising faster than the city average, and I was confident that the trend would continue. I bought the duplex with money I had saved from my investment gains, using a conventional mortgage to finance most of the purchase price. Within 6 months, both units were rented to reliable tenants who paid their rent on time and took reasonable care of the property. Within 2 years, the building was worth 40% more than I had paid for it. The success of that first rental property taught me something crucial about building wealth. While my stock investments grew steadily over time, real estate provided both current income and long-term appreciation. More importantly, it allowed me to use leverage, borrowing money to buy assets that would generate returns greater than the cost of the borrowed money. Over the next 15 years, while Marcus was growing up and going to college and law school, I quietly assembled a portfolio of rental properties throughout the city. Small apartment buildings, single-family houses, commercial spaces that I rented to local businesses. Nothing flashy or expensive, just solid properties in good locations that generated consistent returns. I managed everything myself, from finding tenants to handling repairs to collecting rent. It was time-consuming work that I did evenings and weekends, after my regular accounting clients had been served and Marcus's needs had been met. But it was also deeply satisfying work, the kind of hands-on business building that appealed to my practical nature. By the time Marcus graduated from law school, I owned 12 rental properties worth a combined $3 million. The properties generated enough monthly income to cover all their operating expenses and still provide me with a substantial cash flow that I reinvested in additional properties and stock market investments. But Marcus knew none of this. As far as he was concerned, his mother was a small-town accountant who lived modestly and struggled to afford his educational expenses. The rental properties were managed through a business entity that didn't share my personal name. The investment accounts were held at financial institutions where I wasn't a regular customer. The monthly rent collections and property management activities happened during hours when Marcus wasn't around to observe them. I wasn't deliberately hiding my wealth from him, at least not initially. I simply saw no reason to discuss it with him. The money was intended for my retirement security and long-term financial independence, goals that seemed decades away when Marcus was young. I assumed that someday, when he was older and more mature, we would have conversations about financial planning and wealth building, and the importance of building multiple income streams. But that someday never came. Instead, Marcus's attitude toward money became increasingly entitled and short-sighted. He saw my willingness to pay for his expenses as evidence that I had unlimited resources, rather than understanding that every dollar I spent on his education and lifestyle was a dollar I couldn't invest for the future. He viewed my modest living standards as a character flaw, rather than a conscious choice to maximize my savings rate. When he married Vivian and they began making demands for larger and larger financial contributions, I started to understand that revealing my true financial position would be a mistake. Instead of appreciating my success and respecting my financial acumen, they would see my wealth as something they were entitled to share, something that belonged to them by virtue of family relationship, rather than something I had earned through decades of careful planning and disciplined investing. So I maintained the fiction of the struggling single mother, while quietly continuing to build my financial empire. When they needed money for their house down payment, I provided it from rental property cash flow without explaining where the money actually originated. When they required funding for Vivian's country club membership, I liquidated some stock investments without mentioning that I had dozens of other holdings they knew nothing about. The deception became easier as the years passed and Marcus became more distant. He stopped asking detailed questions about my financial situation, stopped showing interest in my work or my plans for the future. As long as the money appeared when they needed it, he was content to assume that it represented the entirety of my resources, rather than a small fraction of my actual wealth. But maintaining this deception required careful financial management. I had to make sure that my visible lifestyle remained consistent with the image of modest means that Marcus expected. I continued driving older cars, shopping at discount stores, living in the same small house where I had raised him. I avoided obvious displays of wealth that might prompt uncomfortable questions about the sources of my income. At the same time, I was building relationships with financial professionals who understood my actual situation and could help me optimize my wealth-building strategies. Richard Chen, my lawyer, knew about the rental properties because he handled the legal work for property acquisitions and tenant disputes. Margaret Foster, my investment advisor, managed the stock and bond portfolios that had grown to substantial six-figure values. Thomas Walsh, my accountant, prepared the complex tax returns required for someone with multiple income streams and business interests. These professionals became my real financial family, the people who understood and appreciated what I had accomplished as a self-made investor and business owner. While Marcus saw me as someone who needed to be managed and eventually discarded, they saw me as someone whose opinion and experience commanded respect. Margaret Foster, in particular, became both advisor and friend over the years. She was a few years younger than me, but she had built her financial planning practice by working with successful women who had accumulated wealth through their own efforts rather than inheritance or marriage. She understood the psychology of women like me, who had learned to be self-reliant in a world that often underestimated their capabilities. "Elena," she said during one of our quarterly portfolio reviews, "you've built something remarkable here. Most people your age are worried about having enough money for retirement. You could retire tomorrow and maintain your current lifestyle indefinitely." She was right, though I had never thought about my financial situation in those terms. I had been so focused on the accumulation phase, on building wealth and expanding my investments, that I hadn't fully considered what financial independence actually meant. I had the freedom to make choices based on my values and priorities rather than economic necessity. I could afford to take risks, to stand on principle, to refuse to accept treatment that didn't align with my sense of self-worth. This realization crystallized during my meeting with Richard Chen after Marcus had delivered the eviction notice. When Richard asked about my other assets, I finally articulated the full scope of what I had built over the past 30 years. Not just to him, but to myself. I owned rental properties worth over $4 million, generating monthly income of $28,000 after expenses. My investment portfolio contained another $2 million in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, providing dividend income of approximately $6,000 per month. My accounting practice, while small, generated consistent income and had valuable client relationships that could be sold if necessary. Combined, my assets were worth more than $6 million and generated monthly income of over $34,000. More than many people earned in an entire year, enough to support a comfortable lifestyle indefinitely, without touching the principal amounts. I was, by any reasonable definition, wealthy. Not just comfortable or well-off, but genuinely wealthy. I had more money than Marcus and Vivian, more financial security than most people could dream of achieving.
The woman they saw as a burden, as someone whose modest resources they were entitled to exploit, was actually someone who could buy and sell their entire lifestyle without making a meaningful dent in her net worth. But they had no idea, because I had allowed them to remain ignorant. I had perpetuated the myth of the struggling single mother, because it served my purposes, because it allowed me to help Marcus without revealing the full extent of my success, because I wanted him to value education and hard work rather than relying on inherited wealth. Now, sitting in Richard's office with the eviction notice on his desk, I understood that my secrecy had been a strategic mistake. By hiding my wealth, I had allowed Marcus and Vivian to underestimate me, to see me as powerless and dependent rather than strong and self-sufficient. They were making plans based on incomplete information, assuming they were dealing with someone who had no alternatives and no resources for fighting back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "Richard," I said, "I want to understand all of my options. Not just the legal options for challenging the eviction, but the strategic options for protecting my interests and making sure this situation is resolved in a way that serves my long-term goals." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with renewed interest. "What kind of strategic options are you thinking about?" I'm thinking about options that take advantage of information they don't have. Options that use my actual financial position rather than the financial position they think I have. Options that turn their assumptions about me into weaknesses they can't defend against. Elena, that sounds like you're planning some kind of counterattack. That's exactly what I'm planning. They've declared war on someone they think is helpless. I want to show them that they've actually declared war on someone who has resources and connections and options they never considered. Someone who's been underestimated her entire life and is tired of accepting that underestimation. Richard was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing the implications of what I was saying. What do you need from me? I need you to help me understand the legal landscape. If Marcus technically owns the house, what are his vulnerabilities? What mistakes might he make in his eagerness to get rid of me? What pressure points exist that I can exploit? Richard opened a legal pad and began making notes. Well, let's start with the eviction process itself. Even though he owns the house, he can't just throw you out without following proper legal procedures. If he makes mistakes in the process, if he violates tenant rights or fails to provide proper notice, that creates opportunities for legal challenges. What kind of mistakes? Entering the property without permission, changing locks, shutting off utilities. Harassment or intimidation, any behavior that could be characterized as self-help eviction rather than following the court process. I thought about Marcus's personality, his impatience with anything that slowed down his plans, his tendency to cut corners when he thought he could get away with it. He'll make mistakes, he's too arrogant to be careful, and Vivian will push him to move faster than the law allows. There's another angle we should consider, Richard continued. The quitclaim deed that transferred ownership to Marcus. You said you don't remember signing it, that you thought it was refinancing paperwork. If we can prove that you were deceived about the nature of the document, that could be grounds for challenging the transfer. How would we prove deception? Witness statements from people who heard Marcus describe the paperwork differently than what it actually was. Documentation showing that the deed transfer wasn't accompanied by the kind of financial transactions you'd expect with a property sale. Evidence that you received no consideration for transferring ownership of a valuable asset. I thought about this possibility. It was appealing from a justice standpoint, but it would require a lengthy legal battle with uncertain outcomes. Meanwhile, Marcus and Vivian would continue living in the house, benefiting from my generosity while fighting to keep me from reclaiming what was rightfully mine. Richard, I appreciate the legal options, but I'm thinking about something more immediate. Something that doesn't require months of litigation to resolve. What did you have in mind? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. I want to buy the house from Marcus. Richard looked puzzled. Buy it? But you already said he's trying to evict you. Why would he sell it to you? Because I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Not because it's so generous, but because he'll be so desperate to accept it that he won't have any choice. I dialed the number and waited for the answer. Margaret, it's Elena Rodriguez. I need to liquidate some assets quickly. How fast can you convert $2 million worth of stock holdings into cash? Margaret Foster's voice was surprised but professional. Elena, that's a substantial liquidation. Is everything all right? Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm making a strategic acquisition, and I need to move quickly. How soon can you execute the trades? If you're willing to accept market prices, I can have the transactions completed by close of business today. The settlement won't happen for 3 days, but I can arrange a bridge loan against the positions if you need immediate access to funds. Perfect. I'll be in touch with details about where to wire the money. I hung up and turned back to Richard, who was watching me with something approaching awe. Elena, are you planning to buy your own house back from your son? Not exactly. I'm planning to buy the house he thinks he owns, using money he doesn't know I have, in a way that will solve several problems simultaneously. I don't understand. Marcus and Vivian are living beyond their means. They've borrowed heavily against future expectations, including expectations about inheriting money from me someday. Their financial situation is much more precarious than they want to admit, which is why they need to sell the house so quickly. Richard was taking notes, trying to follow my logic. So you think they're financially desperate enough to accept a quick sale? I think they're desperate enough to accept a quick sale from someone they don't recognize as a threat. Someone who appears to be just another investor looking for a good deal, rather than the person they're trying to evict. I explained my plan in detail. Using one of my business entities, I would make a cash offer for the house at slightly below market value, with a closing date just 2 weeks away. The offer would be structured to seem like it was coming from a real estate investor who had heard about the upcoming sale and wanted to avoid the delays and uncertainties of putting the house on the public market. Marcus and Vivian would see the offer as a solution to their cash flow problems. They would get immediate relief from their financial pressures without having to wait for a traditional sale process that could take months. The below-market price would seem like a reasonable trade-off for the speed and certainty of the transaction. But there would be conditions embedded in the purchase agreement that they wouldn't fully understand until after the closing. Conditions that would give me legal control over the property while allowing me to remain in residence. Conditions that would make them technically my tenants rather than my landlords. You want to become their landlord, Richard said, understanding dawning in his voice. I want to become their landlord using money they don't know I have. Buying a house they don't realize I'm buying in a transaction that will reverse our entire relationship without them understanding what happened until it's too late to change it. Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying the notes he had taken. Elena, this is brilliant, and completely ruthless. They've been ruthless with me for years. They've taken advantage of my generosity, exploited my love for my son, and now they're trying to make me homeless so they can finance their upgrade to a more expensive lifestyle. I think some ruthlessness in response is entirely appropriate. What about Marcus? When he realizes what you've done, how do you think he'll react? I considered this question carefully. Marcus would be angry, certainly. He would feel deceived and manipulated, which was ironic given how he had deceived and manipulated me. He would probably try to find legal ways to challenge the transaction, though Richard would make sure the purchase agreement was airtight. But more than anger, I thought Marcus would feel something he hadn't experienced in years: respect. For the first time since he was a child, he would be forced to acknowledge that his mother was smarter and more capable than he had given her credit for. He would have to reckon with the fact that while he had been patronizing me and taking me for granted, I had been building wealth and power that dwarfed his own accomplishments. I think Marcus will learn something important about underestimating people, I said finally. And I think that lesson will be good for him, even if it's painful. When do you want to start this process? Immediately. I want the purchase offer delivered to Marcus within 48 hours, and I want the closing scheduled for next week if possible. The faster we move, the less time they have to think about potential complications. Richard nodded and began making notes about the timeline and legal requirements. I'll need to set up the business entity that will make the purchase, draft the purchase agreement with your special conditions, and arrange for the title company to handle the closing. It's going to be a busy few days. Richard, there's one more thing. I don't want Marcus to know that I'm involved in this transaction until after the closing is completed. As far as he's concerned, he's selling to an anonymous real estate investor who happened to hear about his situation through normal business channels. That's going to require some careful coordination. The closing documents will have your business entity's name on them, and there will be signatures required that could reveal your involvement. Can you handle the closing on my behalf? Power of attorney or something similar? Yes, that's definitely possible. I can execute all the closing documents as your agent, and your identity as the actual purchaser won't be revealed until you choose to disclose it. As I left Richard's office that afternoon, I felt more energized and focused than I had in years. For decades I had been reactive in my relationship with Marcus, responding to his demands and expectations rather than setting my own agenda. I had been generous when I should have been firm, accommodating when I should have been demanding, selfless when I should have been strategic. Now for the first time, I was taking control of the situation. Instead of allowing Marcus and Vivian to dictate the terms of our interaction, I was creating terms that served my interests and reflected my actual position of strength, rather than the position of weakness they imagined I occupied. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. They wanted to sell the house quickly for cash, and I was prepared to buy it quickly for cash. They needed immediate financial relief, and I could provide that relief while simultaneously solving my own housing problem. They assumed they were dealing with a powerless elderly woman, and I was prepared to let them continue making that assumption right up until the moment when the truth became undeniable. But there was more to the plan than just buying back my own house. The purchase was only the first step in a larger strategy that would fundamentally change the balance of power in our relationship and force Marcus to confront the consequences of his years of taking me for granted. The second step involved my rental property portfolio. Marcus and Vivian were planning to use the proceeds from selling my house to buy a larger, more expensive home in Meadowbrook Hills. But what they didn't know was that I owned 3 rental properties in that same exclusive neighborhood, properties I had acquired over the past 5 years, as the area had become increasingly popular with young professionals. The properties were elegant townhouses in a gated community, exactly the kind of upscale housing that Marcus and Vivian aspired to own. The monthly rent on each unit was substantial, reflecting both the desirability of the location and the high-end finishes and amenities that attracted affluent tenants. Currently, all 3 units were occupied by long-term tenants, with lease agreements that wouldn't expire for several months. But lease agreements could be modified if both parties agreed to the changes, and tenants could sometimes be persuaded to relocate early if the right incentives were offered. I had Margaret Foster research the real estate market in Meadowbrook Hills, looking specifically for properties that might appeal to Marcus and Vivian. The search revealed that available inventory was extremely limited, with most desirable homes receiving multiple offers within days of being listed. Properties in their price range were particularly scarce, with waiting lists of qualified buyers hoping for opportunities to purchase. This scarcity created an opportunity for me to influence their housing choices in ways they would never suspect. If I could arrange for one of my rental townhouses to become available just as Marcus and Vivian were beginning their home search, and if I could price the rental competitively with their other options, there was a good chance they would choose to rent from me rather than continue searching for a property to purchase. They would become my tenants without knowing it, paying rent to a business entity that didn't obviously connect to my personal identity. They would be living in a property I owned, subject to lease terms I had crafted, dependent on my goodwill for their housing security. The irony would be perfect. The son who was trying to evict me from my home would be living in a home I owned, vulnerable to eviction if he failed to meet his obligations as a tenant. The daughter-in-law who had spoken so dismissively about people my age would be writing monthly rent checks to someone whose age had given her the time and experience to build wealth they couldn't imagine. But the third step of my plan was the most important, the element that would complete Marcus's education about the consequences of underestimating family members. I had spent 30 years building financial independence partly for my own security, but partly as a legacy I hoped to leave for Marcus and any grandchildren he might have. Despite his treatment of me, despite his growing distance and apparent lack of appreciation for my sacrifices, I had always assumed that my wealth would eventually benefit him. Now I was reconsidering that assumption. If Marcus could so casually discard me when I became inconvenient, if he could treat me as disposable rather than deserving of respect and consideration, then perhaps he didn't deserve to benefit from the wealth I had accumulated through decades of careful planning and disciplined investing. Perhaps my money would do more good if it went to people who actually appreciated education and hard work, and the kind of values I had tried to instill in Marcus, but that he had apparently rejected. Perhaps my legacy should support young people who reminded me of who I used to be, struggling single mothers who needed capital to build businesses, or complete their education or provide stability for their children. I called Margaret Foster again that evening, after I had returned home to the house that Marcus was trying to take from me. Margaret, I want to discuss some estate planning modifications. Significant modifications. Elena, you just liquidated $2 million this morning. Are you sure you want to make major estate planning decisions while you're in the middle of whatever crisis prompted that liquidation? I'm not in a crisis, Margaret. I'm finally clarity about my priorities and my values. I want to change my will to redirect my estate toward charitable purposes, rather than family inheritance. There was a pause while Margaret processed this information. Elena, that's a substantial change. Your current estate plan leaves everything to Marcus, with some smaller bequests to charities. Are you talking about reversing those proportions? I'm talking about leaving Marcus exactly what he's demonstrated that he deserves from me. Nothing. Elena, I have to ask, are you making this decision because you're angry about something that happened recently? Because estate planning decisions made in anger often get revised later when emotions have cooled. I looked around my kitchen, at the home I had worked so hard to provide and maintain, the space where I had nurtured and supported and sacrificed for a son who now wanted to erase me from his life. Margaret, I'm not making this decision because I'm angry. I'm making it because I'm finally thinking clearly. Marcus has made it obvious that he doesn't value me or respect me or consider me an important part of his life. Why should I leave my wealth to someone who has demonstrated so clearly that he doesn't deserve it? What kind of charitable purposes were you thinking about? Scholarship funds for working mothers who want to complete their education. Capital for women starting their own businesses. Housing assistance for single mothers who are trying to provide stability for their children. Programs that help people build wealth and financial independence the way I did, through education and hard work and smart investing. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Elena, that sounds like a beautiful way to create a legacy that reflects your values and experiences. But are you sure you want to completely exclude Marcus? I thought about the question carefully. Was there any part of me that still hoped Marcus would change, that still believed he might someday understand and appreciate what I had done for him? Was there any scenario where cutting him out of my will entirely might be something I would later regret? I'll leave him the house, I said finally. After I buy it back from him, after I've lived in it for as long as I choose, I'll will it to him. Not because he deserves it, but because it's where he grew up, where he learned whatever values he managed to absorb despite his current behavior. That's generous, Elena. No, Margaret. Generous would be leaving him millions of dollars he hasn't earned and doesn't appreciate. Giving him the house is just acknowledging family history, not rewarding family loyalty. By the time I finished my conversation with Margaret and updated my estate planning documents, it was nearly midnight. I sat at my kitchen table looking at the eviction notice Marcus had delivered that morning, and marveled at how much my situation had changed in just 12 hours. This morning I had been a victim, someone whose housing security was threatened by people who took her generosity for granted. Tonight I was someone with a comprehensive plan for turning the tables, someone who was about to demonstrate that years of being underestimated had given me strategic advantages that my opponents couldn't anticipate or defend against. Marcus and Vivian thought they were dealing with a powerless elderly woman whose modest resources made her easy to manipulate and ultimately discard. Instead, they were about to discover that they had declared war on someone whose wealth, intelligence, and strategic thinking far exceeded their own. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to be unforgettable. The purchase offer arrived at Marcus's law office on Thursday afternoon, exactly 48 hours after I had outlined my plan to Richard Chen. The timing was perfect.
Marcus and Vivian had spent the previous 2 days fielding calls from real estate agents who wanted to discuss listing strategies and marketing timelines, conversations that had made them increasingly anxious about how long a traditional sale might take. The offer came from Riverside Property Holdings, a business entity Richard had established for me years earlier to manage some of my rental investments. The letterhead looked professional but unremarkable, the kind of corporate identity that real estate investors use to maintain privacy while conducting business. Marcus called me that evening, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, you're not going to believe this. Someone wants to buy the house, and they're offering cash with a 2-week closing. It's like a miracle." "That's wonderful, Marcus. Who's the buyer?" "Some investment company called Riverside Property Holdings. They must have heard through the grapevine that we were planning to sell. The offer is about $15,000 below what we hoped to get, but with a cash deal and such a quick closing, we'd actually net more money than if we went through the traditional process." I managed to keep my voice neutral, even though I was smiling. "That does sound like good news. Are you going to accept it?" "Vivian and I are meeting with our real estate attorney tomorrow to review the purchase agreement. Assuming everything looks standard, we'll probably sign it this weekend." "Elena, this means you'll need to be out of the house by the end of next week. I know that doesn't give you much time, but this opportunity is too good to pass up." "I understand, Marcus. Family has to come first, right?" There was a brief pause, as if he was trying to determine whether my comment contained some hidden meaning. But Marcus had spent years not paying attention to the subtleties of our conversations, and he wasn't about to start now. "Exactly. I knew you'd understand." "Oh, and Mom, the buyers are requesting that the house be completely empty at closing. They want to do some renovations right away, so they don't want to deal with any remaining belongings or furniture." "Of course they do," I said. "I'll make arrangements." The next week passed in a blur of activity that Marcus and Vivian observed but didn't really understand. They saw me packing boxes and arranging for movers, making phone calls about storage units and temporary housing. What they didn't see was that most of my belongings were being moved to a storage facility I had rented under my business name, and that my temporary housing was actually a suite at the Riverside Inn downtown, a hotel that I owned through another business entity. They also didn't see Richard Chen working around the clock to ensure that every detail of the purchase agreement was legally bulletproof, or Margaret Foster coordinating with the title company to make sure the financial transfers happened smoothly, or the property management company I employed making preparations to welcome new tenants to one of my Meadowbrook Hills townhouses. The closing was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the offices of Consolidated Title Company.
Marcus and Vivian arrived precisely on time, both dressed as if they were attending an important business meeting. Vivian carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people spent on a car payment, and Marcus wore a suit that I recognized as one I had helped him buy for job interviews years earlier. They were led into a conference room where Richard Chen was waiting with what appeared to be representatives from Riverside Property Holdings. In reality, the other people in the room were employees of the title company and the property management firm, but Marcus and Vivian had no reason to question their identities. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez," Richard said, standing to shake their hands, "thank you for being flexible on the timeline. My clients are very pleased to be acquiring such a well-maintained property. It's been in our family for 30 years, Marcus said, and I wondered if he realized the irony of his words. We're confident the new owners will appreciate it as much as we have." The closing process took less than an hour. Marcus and Vivian signed document after document, transferring ownership of my house to my business entity in exchange for a cashier's check that represented money I had earned through decades of careful investing. They walked out of that conference room believing they had just completed a very advantageous business transaction with strangers who happened to be in the right place at the right time. I waited until the following Monday to make my return to the house official. The moving truck arrived at 8 in the morning, and I supervised the return of my furniture and belongings to exactly the places where they had been before Marcus decided to evict me. By noon everything was back to normal, except for one crucial detail. Now the house actually belonged to me in every legal sense, not just emotional and historical. Marcus called me that afternoon, his voice confused and concerned. "Mom, Mrs. Peterson next door said she saw a moving truck at the house this morning. She thought maybe the new owners were moving in, but when she looked outside later, she swore she saw your car in the driveway." "That's strange," I said. "Maybe Mrs. Peterson needs her eyes checked." "Mom, are you at the house right now?" "I'm sitting in my kitchen looking out at the garden I planted 25 years ago." There was a long silence. "That's impossible. We sold the house on Friday. The new owners have the deed." "Marcus, you're absolutely right. The new owners do have the deed. I'm looking at it right now actually. It's quite official, with all the proper signatures and notarizations." "I don't understand what you're telling me." "I'm telling you that Riverside Property Holdings purchased your house for cash, exactly as agreed. What I'm not telling you is who owns Riverside Property Holdings." Another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind as he tried to process what he was hearing. "Mom, are you saying that you bought the house?" "I'm saying that I bought my house back from the son who tricked me into signing it away 3 years ago. I'm saying that while you were planning to make me homeless, I was planning to demonstrate the difference between someone who talks about success and someone who actually achieves it." The sound Marcus made wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a moan. It was the sound of someone's entire worldview collapsing in real time. Where did you get the money?" "Marcus, for 30 years you've assumed that I was a struggling single mother living paycheck to paycheck. Someone whose modest savings account could be drained by your educational expenses and lifestyle choices. You never asked where the money actually came from. You never wondered how someone working as a freelance accountant could afford to pay for Columbia and Harvard Law School and your wedding and your house down payment and all the other financial emergencies that seemed to arise whenever you needed them. I assumed you were sacrificing everything for me. I was sacrificing some things for you, but while I was doing that, I was also building wealth you knew nothing about. Real estate investments, stock portfolios, business ventures. While you were taking my generosity for granted, I was becoming financially independent in ways you never bothered to discover." There was a crash in the background, as if something had been dropped or thrown. Vivian's voice came through the phone, shrill and demanding. "Marcus, what's happening? Why are you making those noises?" I could hear Marcus trying to explain the situation to his wife, his words coming in fragmented bursts as he struggled to articulate something that didn't make sense to him. Vivian's responses grew louder and more agitated as she began to understand what he was telling her. "That's impossible," she shouted, loud enough for me to hear clearly. "She's just a secretary. She drives an old car, she shops at Walmart, she can't afford to buy a house for cash." "Vivian," I said, raising my voice so she could hear me through the phone, "you've spent 5 years making assumptions about who I am based on how I choose to live, not on what I'm actually capable of achieving.
That was your mistake, not mine. Elena. Vivian's voice was closer to the phone now. What kind of game are you playing? I'm not playing a game, dear. I'm demonstrating the consequences of underestimating people. You and Marcus decided I was disposable, someone whose feelings and needs didn't matter as long as you got what you wanted. You made that decision based on the assumption that I was powerless to resist your plans. You can't do this, Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as his shock transformed into anger. There has to be some kind of law against this. You can't trick your own family into selling you their property. Actually, I can. Richard Chen made sure every aspect of the transaction was completely legal. You received fair market value for a property you legitimately owned. The fact that you sold it to someone you didn't recognize doesn't invalidate the sale. But you lied to us. You misrepresented yourself. Marcus, I never said a word to you about this transaction. You dealt with my representatives, who handled everything in a completely professional manner. If you want to talk about misrepresentation, let's discuss how you got me to sign away my ownership of this house in the first place, by telling me I was signing refinancing paperwork. That stopped his complaints immediately. Marcus knew that if anyone had grounds for alleging fraud or misrepresentation, it was me, not him. What happens now? Vivian asked, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. Now you learn what it feels like to deal with someone who has options instead of someone who can be taken advantage of. Now you discover whether you're as good at asking for favors as you are at demanding them. Are you going to let us visit? Marcus asked, and the question broke my heart a little. For just a moment he sounded like the child he used to be, uncertain and hoping for reassurance. Marcus, you're my son, you'll always be welcome in my home, as long as you remember that it's my home, and I'm the one who sets the rules for how guests behave here. Over the following weeks, the full scope of my strategic planning became clear to Marcus and Vivian. The house sale that was supposed to fund their upgrade to Meadowbrook Hills had instead returned the property to me, while providing them with money they now needed for a place to live. Their search for a suitable rental in their preferred neighborhood led them, through a series of carefully orchestrated coincidences, to one of my townhouse properties. The rental application process was handled by my property management company, so Marcus and Vivian never realized they were asking to become my tenants. They simply knew that after weeks of frustrating searches, they had finally found a beautiful home in the right neighborhood at a price they could afford. The lease they signed made them subject to all the standard obligations of responsible tenancy, timely rent payments, proper maintenance of the property, respect for their landlord's rights and expectations. For the first time in their adult lives, they were accountable to someone else for their housing security. I let them get settled in their new home before revealing the final piece of my strategy. The disclosure came during a family dinner I invited them to attend, the first meal we had shared in my house since I had reclaimed ownership. I have some news to share with both of you, I said over dessert, a homemade apple pie that Marcus had always loved. I've made some changes to my estate planning. Marcus and Vivian exchanged glances. They had been wondering when this conversation would happen, when we would discuss how my demonstrated wealth would impact their financial future. I've decided to redirect most of my estate toward charitable purposes. Scholarship funds for working mothers, capital for women starting small businesses, housing assistance for single parents. Organizations that help people build financial independence through education and hard work. The silence stretched for several minutes. Finally, Marcus found his voice. What does that mean for us? It means that you'll inherit this house after I'm gone, because it's where you grew up and where you learned whatever values you've managed to retain. But the rest of my wealth will go to people who demonstrate the kind of appreciation and respect that I haven't seen from you in recent years. Vivian's face flushed red. You can't punish us forever for one mistake. Vivian, I'm not punishing you. I'm rewarding people who deserve to be rewarded. If you think that constitutes punishment, perhaps you should reflect on why you feel entitled to benefit from wealth you didn't earn, and apparently don't respect. But we're family, Marcus said. Yes, we are. Which is why you'll always have a place at my table and a key to my door. But being family doesn't entitle you to my money, especially when you've demonstrated that you see me as an obstacle to your goals rather than a person worthy of consideration and respect. I stood up and began clearing the dishes, a domestic activity that felt different now than it had for years.
Before I had served my family out of obligation and habit, performing the role of caretaker because it was expected of me. Now I was choosing to provide hospitality because I wanted to, because it pleased me to do so, not because I felt compelled to earn their approval. The good news, I continued, is that you're both young and capable, you have excellent educations, promising careers, and the opportunity to build your own wealth through your own efforts. You don't need to inherit money from me to have successful, fulfilling lives. Mom, Marcus said, and his voice carried a note I hadn't heard since he was much younger. I know I haven't been a good son lately. I know I've taken you for granted and made assumptions that were unfair. Is there any way to fix this? I looked at my son, seeing past the expensive suit and carefully styled hair to the boy who had once helped me plant flowers in the front yard, who had sat quietly in the back of my college classrooms while I pursued the education that would secure our future. Marcus, there's always a way to fix things between people who love each other. But it requires acknowledging what went wrong, making genuine efforts to change, and understanding that some consequences can't be erased just because you regret the actions that caused them. What kind of efforts? The kind that demonstrate respect instead of just demanding it. The kind that show appreciation instead of just assuming it. The kind that recognize other people as individuals with their own needs and feelings instead of treating them as resources to be exploited. 6 months later, Marcus and Vivian were still my tenants, though their relationship with me had evolved in ways I hadn't expected. Marcus had begun visiting regularly, not because he needed something from me, but because he seemed to genuinely enjoy our conversations. He asked questions about my business investments, sought advice about his own career decisions, expressed interest in learning about wealth-building strategies he had never considered. Vivian remained more distant, but she was unfailingly polite and respectful in our interactions. I suspected that living as my tenant had taught her something about the dynamics of power and dependency, about what it felt like to be accountable to someone whose goodwill you couldn't take for granted. The change I valued most was Marcus's growing understanding of who I actually was, as opposed to who he had assumed I was. He began to see me as someone who had achieved remarkable success through her own intelligence and determination, rather than someone whose only value lay in her willingness to sacrifice for his benefit. Mom, he said, one Sunday afternoon as we worked together in the garden, I owe you an apology that's about 30 years overdue. For what specifically? For never asking you about your dreams, your goals, your plans for the future. For assuming that your life was all about me, instead of understanding that you had your own aspirations and achievements. For treating you like a supporting character in my story instead of recognizing that you were the hero of your own story. I looked at my son, kneeling in the dirt beside me, carefully transplanting seedlings with the same attention to detail he had shown as a child. Marcus, the apology I really want is much simpler than that. What is it? I want you to apologize for trying to make me homeless. Not for the financial implications, or the legal complications, but for being willing to cause me that kind of fear and uncertainty. For deciding that my comfort and security mattered less than your convenience. His hand stopped moving, and he looked directly into my eyes. Mom, I am deeply, profoundly sorry for trying to evict you. It was cruel and selfish and completely inexcusable. You deserved so much better from me, especially after everything you've done to support my life and career. Thank you, I said simply. That means more to me than you know. As we continued working in the garden, I reflected on how much our relationship had changed since that March morning when he had handed me the eviction notice. The power dynamics had been completely reversed, but more importantly, the respect and appreciation I had always hoped for were finally becoming real. Marcus was learning to value his mother not as a resource to be exploited, but as a person to be admired. And I was learning to use my strength and independence, not just to protect myself, but to teach the people I loved about the consequences of taking each other for granted. The woman who had been treated like garbage had transformed herself into someone who commanded respect, not through cruelty or revenge, but through the patient demonstration of her own worth and capability. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, delivered by the people we thought we knew best, when they finally reveal who they really are beneath the surface we had mistaken for the whole truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.